The shocking news is out on Bill Murray, and it isn't good. For decades, he was Hollywood's most beloved eccentric. The deadpan comedy legend whose random appearances at college parties, photobombed engagement shoots, and unpredictable public antics created an almost mythical reputation. His off-screen persona seemed to perfectly complement his on-screen roles, making him one of the rare celebrities admired not only for talent but also for personality.
I think
Yet
the
behind
world
that
map.
carefully cultivated image of charming spontaneity, a much darker reality has long circulated within the entertainment industry. What insiders once whispered about is now being confronted publicly, forcing a painful reassessment of behavior that was tolerated for far too long for years. The mythology surrounding Murray was powerful enough to overshadow the reality. Quirky. Stories of him crashing weddings or washing dishes at house
tell me
parties
about this fascinating
made great talk show
project you're
fodder
working
and
on.
reinforced the idea that he was simply an unpredictable free spirit. But according to industry veterans, those stories also help mask troubling patterns that many insiders had recognized for decades. As new allegations have emerged and old stories have resurfaced under fresh scrutiny, the distinction between eccentric genius and problematic behavior has become impossible to ignore. Hollywood's long-standing tolerance of his conduct is now facing unprecedented challenge. That reckoning accelerated with the collapse of the film being mortal. In April 2022, production on the $35 million project, directed by Aziz Ansari and co-starring Seth Rogen, was abruptly shut down after a female crew member filed a formal complaint alleging inappropriate behavior by Murray. The film, based on a book by Atale Gabandi, was suspended by Searchlight Pictures, a subsidiary of Disney, pending an internal investigation. Despite the financial stakes in Murray's star power, the studio did not rush to resume production. And years later, the film remains effectively shelved. Reporting from outlets including People revealed that Murray allegedly
I've
kissed
never
a
seen
much
a person
younger
change
female production
so
assistant
much.
while both were wearing masks under COVID. The protocols and engaged in other unwanted physical contact that made her uncomfortable. Following the investigation, Murray reportedly reached a settlement of roughly $100,000 with the woman, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement. For many in Hollywood, the financial settlement and the decision to abandon such a costly project underscored the seriousness of the situation. What made the incident particularly jarring was how sharply it clashed with Murray's public image. The man known for spontaneous, joyful interactions with strangers was now accused of crossing boundaries in ways that left a colleague feeling violated, enough to risk her career by filing a formal complaint. Industry experts emphasized the power imbalance at play, noting that it takes extraordinary courage for a junior crew member to come forward against a figure of Murray's stature. Murray eventually addressed the incident in a January 2025 interview with The Guardian. Rather than easing concerns, his comments raised new ones. He described himself as feeling barbecued by the situation and framed the incident as a misunderstanding, saying he thought what he did was funny and meant as a joke. More troubling was his admission that he had done similar things before and that such behavior used to get laughs. While he acknowledged that times have changed, his emphasis on intent over impact and on his own discomfort rather. The woman's experience suggested fundamental misunderstanding of consent and workplace boundaries. Observers noted that Murray's response followed a familiar pattern seen when powerful men are confronted with misconduct allegations. Partial acknowledgement coupled with language that subtly shifts blame to changing social norms. His failure to offer a direct apology to the woman involved, despite having reached a financial settlement, reinforced perceptions that he viewed himself primarily as the victim of the situation. The industry reaction that followed was unusually restrained. When Scarlett Johansson, who starred with Murray in Lost in Translation, directed by Sofia Coppola, addressed the controversy in a 2025 profile for Vanity Fair, she did not dismiss it. Instead, she described what happened as really bad and suggested that Murray had been forced to face hard truths. Coming from an A-list star known for her discretion, the comment carried significant weight. Other collaborators were more cautious publicly but candid in private. Industry insiders noted the absence of a coordinated defense from co-stars and directors, Silence that suggested many people had difficult experiences with Murray but previously lacked the power or context to speak openly. Even longtime collaborator Wes Anderson offered a measured assessment in The New Yorker, acknowledging that while Murray brings something unique to projects, working with him has not always been easy. Public perception shifted further in early 2025 after a series of viral incidents. At a Broadway performance of Death of a Salesman, cell phone videos captured Murray aggressively confronting a theatergoer during intermission over alleged phone use, prompting security intervention. Weeks later, during an appearance on The Tonight Show, Murray unexpectedly grabbed and kissed Naomi Watts on the lips on camera. What's visible surprise and subsequent social media post emphasizing that consent matters intensified backlash and fueled the sense that Murray had not adjusted his behavior despite recent consequences. These public moments made it harder for fans to separate Murray's charming myth from the troubling patterns long reported behind the scenes. Social media sentiment shifted sharply, with many expressing disappointment and disillusionment. For critics, these incidents demonstrated how behavior once framed as eccentricity could no longer be excused when viewed through the lens of consent and power. As scrutiny intensified,
that's right.
Stories about Murray's onset
I
behavior
think the
were
world
re-examined.
map.
From his early days on Saturday Night Live to later film sets, accounts emerged of volatility, bullying, and abuse. His fractured relationship with director Harold Ramis after films like Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day was cited as evidence of how severe those conflicts could become. Actor Richard Dreyfuss has described an incident during What About Bob in which Murray allegedly threw an ashtray at his head. Lucy Liu has spoken about verbal abuse during the filming of Charlie's Angels.
So, tell me about
Director
this
P.J.
fascinating
Hogan recalled
project you're working
disruptive
on.
behavior on My Best Friend's wedding, particularly troubling, were accounts from women. In her memoir, Geena Davis described repeated boundary violations during the making of Quick Change, including unwanted physical contact despite her clear refusals. Anonymous testimonies from women in junior positions echoed similar experiences, highlighting the power imbalance that made speaking out risky. Another aspect now being reassessed is Murray's long-standing refusal to have an agent or manager. Once portrayed as quirky independence, industry insiders now suggest this arrangement shielded him from accountability. Without representatives to manage relationships and address concerns, there was often no clear channel for productions to confront problematic behavior. The absence of that feedback loop may have allowed troubling patterns to persist unchecked for years. Taken together, these revelations have transformed the narrative around Bill Murray. What was once dismissed as eccentric genius is increasingly understood as a pattern of boundary violations enabled by power, fame, and an industry willing to look the other way. As Hollywood continues to grapple with questions of accountability,
I've never seen a person change
and
so
workplace
much.
culture. Murray's case stands as a stark example of how myth can obscure harm and how long it can take for that myth to finally collapse. As the reassessment of Murray's behavior continues, the broader implications extend far beyond one actor's career. Hollywood is being forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how long it has protected powerful men by reframing abusive or inappropriate conduct as temperament, genius, or harmless eccentricity. Murray's case has become emblematic of a larger cultural shift, one in which legacy status no longer guarantees immunity and where stories once laughed off as colorful anecdotes are now recognized as warning signs that should have been addressed. Decades earlier, for many industry veterans, the most unsettling aspect is not that these allegations exist, but that so many people privately acknowledge they were not surprised. Producers, crew members, and fellow actors have quietly admitted that Murray's reputation for volatility and boundary pushing was an open secret. The difference now is that the cultural context has changed. Behavior that once hid behind humor or star power is being reinterpreted through a clearer understanding of consent, power dynamics, and workplace responsibility. What was once excused as that's just how he is no longer an acceptable explanation. This shift is also forced fans to grapple with their own complicity in maintaining the Bill Murray mythology. For years, audiences enthusiastically shared stories of his random encounters, reinforcing the idea that he existed outside normal social rules in a way that was charming rather than troubling. In hindsight, critics argue that same disregard for boundaries is what allowed problematic behavior to flourish unchecked. The line between spontaneity and entitlement is thin, and in Murray's case, that line appears to have been crossed repeatedly. Studios are now recalculating the risk, associated with working with him. While no formal blacklist exists, insiders say Murray has become a liability in ways he never was before. Insurance costs rise when an actor is perceived as unpredictable or legally risky. And the being mortal shutdown remains a cautionary tale executives are reluctant to repeat. Several projects rumored to be courting Murray have quietly moved in. Other directions opting for actors who offer less brilliance, perhaps, but far fewer complications. The question of accountability looms large. Murray has not faced criminal charges, and the settlement related to being mortal resolved that case. Legally, but culturally, the reckoning is far from over. Accountability in this context is not only about punishment, but about acknowledgement, understanding, and change. Rather than genuinely reflective, without a clear demonstration that he understands why his actions were harmful, skepticism remains about whether meaningful change is possible. Some observers point to age and generational disconnect as partial explanations, though not excuses. Murray came of age in an industry where lines were routinely blurred and bad behavior was often rewarded. But others counter that plenty of his contemporaries have adapted, learned, and taken responsibility when confronted. The issue, they argue, is not that Murray didn't know better, but that he was rarely forced to do better. There is also the unresolved tension between art and artist. Murray's performances in films like Lost in Translation, Groundhog Day, and Ghostbusters remain culturally significant and for many fans emotionally important. The discomfort now lies in reconciling that admiration with the emerging picture of the man behind those roles. Some viewers choose to separate the work from the individual, while others find that separation increasingly difficult. Neither response offers an easy resolution, and the debate itself reflects a society still negotiating how to engage with art. Created by flawed or harmful figures, women in the industry have emphasized that the focus should not center solely on Murray's fall from grace, but on the systemic conditions that allowed his behavior to persist. For every famous story now being re-examined, are countless unnamed individuals whose careers were affected in quieter ways. People who left projects, changed paths, or endured discomfort because speaking up felt too risky.
The world map.
Their experiences rarely make headlines, but they represent the true cost of Hollywood's tolerance. The role of silence is another critical piece of this story. Many collaborators who now express concern admit they stayed quiet for years, either out of loyalty, fear, or resignation. That silence, while understandable in a punitive industry, contributed to the continuation of harm. The current moment has made clear that neutrality often favors the powerful.
So,
and that
tell me about this fascinating project you're working on.
Murray's unusual professional isolation, long framed as rebellion against Hollywood machinery, is now viewed through a harsher lens. Without agents or managers to act as intermediaries, he existed largely outside the informal systems that check behavior and mediate conflicts. While this arrangement gave him freedom, it also removed friction, the kind that forces reflection and correction. In retrospect, what looked like independence increasingly resembles insulation. There is also a cautionary lesson here for younger performers and creators. Murray's career demonstrates how unchecked power can distort self-perception. When jokes always land, when consequences never arrive, and when people around you adapt rather than challenge, it becomes easy to believe that intent outweighs impact. The result is a dangerous disconnect, one that only becomes visible when the cultural tide finally turns. As for Murray himself, his future remains uncertain. He is not universally shunned, nor is he universally defended. Instead, he occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, a legacy figure whose past achievements are undeniable and whose present reputation is deeply compromised.
So much.
Whether he chooses to engage in genuine accountability, retreat from public life, or continue as before will shape how this chapter ultimately closes. Some industry watchers believe this moment could still serve as a turning point. They argue that real accountability does not require public self-flagellation, but it does require clarity, humility, and demonstrated change. That might mean stepping back, listening rather than explaining, and acknowledging harm without qualifiers. Whether Murray is willing or able to do that remains an open question. What is clear is that the era of unconditional indulgence is over. Hollywood's tolerance for difficult geniuses is waning as the human cost of that tolerance becomes impossible to ignore. Murray's story, painful as it is for fans and collaborators alike, has become part of a larger narrative about power, accountability, and the stories industries tell themselves to avoid change. In the end, the reassessment of Bill Murray is not just about one man's behavior. It is about a culture learning, slowly and imperfectly, to draw firmer lines around respect and consent. It is about recognizing that charm can coexist with harm and that laughter does not erase impact. And it is about acknowledging that myths, no matter how beloved, must eventually yield to truth. As this reckoning deepens, another uncomfortable reality has begun to surface. Many of the systems that protected Murray are still very much in place. While his case has become a high-profile example, it is not an outlier. Hollywood's history is filled with figures whose behavior was tolerated, excused, or reframed because of their perceived value. What makes this moment different is not moral perfection, but exhaustion. Audiences, crew members, and even studios are increasingly unwilling to keep absorbing the damage caused by unchecked power. For crew members and junior employees, Murray's story has become a kind of cautionary symbol. It highlights how vulnerable positions on a set often come with an unspoken expectation of endurance. Laugh it off. Don't make waves. Don't be the one who ruins the production. Those pressures are especially acute when the person causing harm is famous, beloved, and surrounded by a mythology that casts them as harmless. The emotional labor required to navigate those environments rarely shows up in box office numbers or awards seasons. But it leaves lasting scars. The language used for decades to describe Murray's conduct now sounds hollow. Words like mercurial, moody, and unpredictable once signaled creative depth. Today, they read more like euphemisms for behavior that made workplaces unsafe or uncomfortable. That shift in language matters because it shapes what people are willing to tolerate. When bad behavior is romanticized, it becomes invisible. When it is named accurately, it becomes harder to defend. There is also a generational element to how this story is being received. Younger audiences, raised in a culture more fluent in conversations about consent and boundaries, have less patience for explanations rooted in intent or tradition. To them, the idea that someone could repeatedly ignore clear refusals and still be seen as charming feels absurd. This generational divide is contributing to the speed with which Murray's reputation has unraveled in public spaces, even as parts of the industry remain cautious. The emotional response from longtime fans has been complex. For many, Murray's films are tied to formative memories, moments of comfort, or personal meaning. Discovering that the man behind those performances may have caused real harm creates a sense of betrayal that is difficult to process. Some respond with denial, clinging to the idea that the allegations are exaggerated. Others experience grief, mourning not just a favorite actor, but the illusion that talent and kindness always go hand in hand. What often gets lost in these conversations is the cumulative effect of years of unchecked behavior. Harm is rarely confined to a single dramatic incident. More often, it accumulates through countless small moments. A joke that lands wrong, a touch that lingers too long, an outburst that changes the mood of a room. Each incident on its own can be dismissed. Together, they create a pattern that defines a workplace.
I think the world map.
Murray's story illustrates how easy it is for that accumulation to be ignored when the person at the center is powerful enough. There's also the question of why accountability so often arrives late. In Murray's case, the most serious consequences did not come until decades into his career, long after patterns had solidified. By then, change is harder, habits are entrenched, and self-reflection can feel like an attack rather than an opportunity. Earlier intervention might not have erased harm, but it could have limited it.
So,
that missed opportunity
tell me about
is
this fascinating project you're working
now
on.
Reckon with. Some defenders argue that Murray is being judged by standards that did not exist when much of his behavior occurred. Critics counter that basic respect and consent are not modern inventions. What has changed is not morality, but whose voices are heard. The people who were uncomfortable, frightened, or humiliated before are now more likely to be believed. That shift does not rewrite the past, but it does illuminate it. The ongoing conversation around Murray also reveals how accountability is often misunderstood. It is not synonymous with exile or destruction. At its core, accountability means acknowledging harm without minimizing it, accepting consequences without resentment, and changing behavior without demanding forgiveness. Whether Murray can or will move toward that kind of accountability remains uncertain. But the lack of clear movement in that direction has fueled skepticism. For Hollywood, the lesson is not just about one actor, but about incentives. As brilliance is rewarded more consistently than decency, the same patterns will repeat. Real change requires structures that prioritize safety and respect alongside creativity. That means clearer
I've never
reporting
seen a
mechanisms,
person
stronger
change
protections for
so
those who
much.
speak up, and a willingness to walk away from projects when lines are crossed. Even at significant financial cost, The conversation has also extended beyond Hollywood, resonating with workplaces everywhere. Murray's case mirrors dynamics familiar to many people outside entertainment.
Ladies
A
and
powerful
gentlemen,
figure whose
tonight
behavior is
is a
excused,
special night
a culture
filled
that
with
rewards
laughter
silence,
and joy.
and a reckoning that comes only after years of damage. That broader resonance is part of why this story has struck such a nerve. Ultimately, the collapse of the Bill Murray mythology is not a simple fall from grace. It is a slow, painful unraveling of a narrative that many people wanted to believe. It forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that charm can coexist with cruelty, and that talent does not immunize someone against causing harm. The work now lies not in deciding whether to cancel or defend him, but in learning from what his story reveals about power, silence, and the cost of looking the other way for too long. Whether Murray's legacy will eventually include genuine accountability or remain defined by unresolved tension is still unknown. What is clear is that the cultural ground beneath him has shifted. The laughter that once covered discomfort no longer carries the same weight. And in that shift there is at least the possibility that future stories will be handled sooner, more honestly, and with far less damage to those who have historically paid the price.